Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Unexpected Stop. Jamal Hayes, a judge with a reputation for fairness and integrity, had spent the entire day in the courtroom. It had been one of those days when the weight of justice seemed almost unbearable. He had presided over a high-profile case that had taken weeks to prepare, full of complex arguments and difficult decisions. By the end of the trial, Jamal had found peace in knowing that he had made the right ruling. His decision would resonate in the legal community for years to come, setting a new precedent for similar cases. Despite the emotional toll of the day, Jamal felt a sense of pride. He had done his duty. After leaving the courthouse, Jamal decided to take a drive through his neighborhood. He had lived on the outskirts of the city for several years now, in a quiet, well-maintained area that had become a sanctuary for him. The sprawling lawns and grand homes were a stark contrast to the chaos of the courtroom, offering him solace. He slid into his sleek black sedan, a car he had worked hard to afford, a symbol of his success, though not overly flashy. It was a quiet luxury, just enough to show he had arrived, but never meant to flaunt. Jamal rolled down the windows as he cruised down the familiar streets, the cool evening air drifting through the car. His mind wandered to the week ahead. Another tough case was looming, one that would require his full attention. But for now, he could relax. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood. The kind of evening that felt like it belonged to someone who had earned a moment of peace. As he turned onto a quieter road, he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. His fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel, instinctively preparing himself for what he knew was about to happen. It wasn't the first time he had been stopped by a police officer in this neighborhood, but something about this felt different. The blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, and he let out a slow breath. Jamal was no stranger to being stopped by the police. Being a black man in a well-to-do area often led to unnecessary scrutiny, and despite his position as a judge, he had been stopped more times than he cared to admit. But he was determined not to let this moment ruin his evening. He glanced at his speedometer, noting that he was well within the speed limit. The officer was clearly pulling him over for something else. He signaled to the side of the road, and the patrol car slid in behind him, its headlights flashing against the darkening sky. As Jamal watched the officer approach, he did his best to maintain his composure. He wasn't angry yet, just curious. What had prompted this stop? The officer, a white female, was walking toward him with a stern look on her face, her hand resting on the holstered gun at her side. Jamal rolled down his window, feeling a small wave of annoyance wash over him, but he kept it in check. He knew this was not the moment to show frustration. "License and registration," the officer ordered, her tone sharp and demanding. Jamal could sense something in her voice, an undercurrent of suspicion that seemed out of place for a routine stop. He reached for his wallet and handed over the documents without a word. His fingers were steady, but inside, he could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jamal asked, his voice calm, though there was a hint of confusion. Officer Michaels didn't respond immediately. She took his documents and studied them with exaggerated attention. She glanced from the papers to Jamal, then back at the car, as if searching for something that didn't exist. It was a deliberate show, and Jamal could feel the moment stretching uncomfortably between them. "This your car?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "Yes, it is," Jamal replied, his tone firm but measured. "Is there something wrong, officer?" The officer paused, as if considering her next move. Her gaze shifted to the neighborhood around them, scrutinizing the peaceful surroundings. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," she said, her eyes narrowing. "And this car matches the description of one that was reported stolen." Jamal felt a flicker of disbelief rise within him. Stolen? This was his car. He had worked hard to earn it, and now it was being questioned based on nothing more than suspicion. He had lived in this neighborhood for years. Was his success so foreign to her that she couldn't accept that he belonged here? "I live here, officer," Jamal said, his voice even, though his patience was wearing thin. This is my neighborhood. This is my car. Officer Michaels didn't seem convinced. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words, but ultimately choosing to dismiss them. "We'll see about that," she said, her tone turning cold. "Step out of the vehicle." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He had dealt with this before, the moment when an officer decided that skin color, more than anything else, dictated how they would treat you. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed he didn't belong. But he wasn't just any man. He was Judge Jamal Hayes. And though his position in society could have shielded him from many injustices, it did nothing to stop the bias and racism that pervaded the world. Still, he knew better than to argue. In a situation like this, his calmness was his weapon. He had to be careful. He had to think about how his next move would shape everything. As he stepped out of the car, he kept his hands visible at all times, his eyes steady on the officer as she instructed him to place his hands on the hood. The officer began patting him down, making snide remarks as she did. "Nice suit. Must be one of those businessmen, huh? Or did you steal that too?" Jamal's jaw clenched, but he kept his mouth shut. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, curious, concerned, some of them already stepping out of their homes to see what was happening. The indignity of it all, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, was almost too much to bear. But he swallowed his anger. If he let it show now, it would only escalate things. The officer's hands were all over his car now, rifling through the glove compartment, checking under the seats, even opening his briefcase and inspecting its contents. Jamal remained still, his breath steady, his mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. He was just a few miles from home, yet he felt like an outsider in a place that was supposed to be his sanctuary. Minutes dragged on, and finally, Officer Michaels walked back to him, her face a mask of indifference. "Everything seems clean," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'm going to need to take you down to the station to clear this up." Jamal stood there for a moment, stunned. To the station? He had followed every order, every command she had given him. And yet, she was still making the decision to escalate things. This wasn't about protocol, it was about something deeper, something more dangerous. He met her gaze, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "To the station? On what grounds?" he asked, his voice rising. The officer crossed her arms and stared at him with an air of superiority. "I don't like your attitude. And something about this doesn't sit right with me." Jamal's heart raced, not from fear, but from the injustice of it all. He wasn't just another black man being pulled over by a police officer. He was a judge, a figure who had spent his life advocating for fairness and equality. But none of that seemed to matter. In her eyes, he was just another suspect, guilty by the mere fact that he was black and driving a nice car. With a steady breath, Jamal reached for his phone. He dialed a number, speaking calmly into the receiver as Officer Michaels stood by, watching him with suspicion. Her eyes narrowed. "Calling someone to help you out of this," she sneered. "Go ahead." Jamal didn't answer her. Instead, he made the call. His voice was steady, each word carefully chosen. After hanging up, he turned back to the officer, his gaze unwavering. "I suggest you wait here for a few minutes." Her brow furrowed. "Is that a threat?" "No," Jamal said firmly. "It's a warning." And so, the scene unfolded. What started as an ordinary drive home had quickly turned into a standoff. But Jamal knew that this moment, this confrontation, was bigger than just him. It was about all the people who had been stopped, questioned, and mistreated simply because of the color of their skin. And he was determined to make sure this wasn't just another forgotten story. The confrontation escalates. The quiet neighborhood, usually so peaceful, had been transformed into a stage for a tense drama unfolding under the warm evening sky. Jamal stood there, his hands still resting on the hood of his car, his mind racing. He knew this moment could easily spiral out of control. He had seen enough in his career to understand that something as simple as a traffic stop could turn dangerous in an instant. And yet, he couldn't help but feel a deep frustration that it had come to this, being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, despite everything he had accomplished. Jamal knew how quickly tensions could rise when racial bias entered the equation. He had spent years in the courtroom, navigating complex cases where justice often seemed elusive. But this was different. This was personal. His heart was heavy with the weight of what was happening, not just to him, but to every person who had ever been unfairly targeted because of their skin color. As he stood there, keeping his composure, Officer Michaels didn't let up. She continued to watch him closely, her eyes flicking between his face and the car, as if she was trying to find something, anything, that would justify the stop. Jamal could feel her distrust radiating from her, the way she lingered just a little too long on his every move, trying to make sense of him in the wrong way. He had always known that the system, though designed to deliver justice, was often plagued by biases that made it anything but fair. But standing in the middle of the street, under the harsh glow of the police cars' flashing lights, the reality of it hit him harder than ever before. The minutes stretched on as they stood in a charged silence. The sound of distant voices could be heard from the neighboring homes, where a few residents had come outside to witness the interaction. Jamal could feel their eyes on him, curious, uneasy, maybe even some sympathetic. But it was the officer's continued scrutiny that grated on him. Officer Michaels seemed almost irritated by the phone call he had made. She stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently as she glared at him. The seconds felt like an eternity. Every time she looked at him, Jamal could sense the suspicion in her gaze, as if she were hoping that her assumptions about him would be validated. But Jamal knew better. He had seen this before, the way that people's perceptions of him had been shaped by the color of his skin, rather than the content of his character. He could feel the simmering tension building between them, each word exchanged a small spark threatening to ignite a larger fire. Then, just as Jamal had braced himself for what was coming next, the sound of another car approaching cut through the tension. He turned his head slightly, and a second patrol car pulled up beside Officer Michaels' vehicle. This car was marked with the official insignia of the city's police department, its lights flashing in stark contrast to the quiet evening. Jamal stood there, his back straight and his eyes focused, though his mind was spinning. Who was this new arrival? Was it more of the same, another officer showing up to back up the misguided judgment of his colleague? Or was this an opportunity for things to be set right? A man in a well-tailored suit stepped out of the passenger side of the car. His movements were quick and purposeful, his expression grim as he made his way toward Officer Michaels. Jamal watched him closely, wondering if this was the moment when someone would finally realize the mistake being made here. Officer Michaels, the man said, his voice firm as he approached the two of them. What is going on here? Officer Michaels, who had been radiating an air of authority just moments before, now seemed uncertain. She glanced at the newcomer, her eyes flickering with an almost imperceptible panic. Just doing my job, she replied, her tone defensive, but lacking the confidence she had shown earlier. The man didn't seem to be swayed. He looked from Michaels to Jamal, his gaze sharp, assessing. He seemed to notice the way Jamal stood there, tall, calm, composed, and something shifted in his expression. Do you have any idea who this is? The man asked, his voice laden with urgency. There was no mistaking the gravity of his question. Officer Michaels blinked, clearly thrown off by the question. I thought he might be the suspect in a stolen vehicle case, she stammered. The man let out a heavy sigh, frustration evident in his face. You thought? He repeated. Officer Michaels, this is Judge Jamal Hayes. He paused for a moment to let the weight of the name sink in. One of the most respected judges in the state. The officer's face went pale as the realization hit her. She took a step back, clearly rattled by the man's words. Her earlier confidence seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by a growing sense of panic. Her mouth opened, but no words came out at first. I didn't know, she finally muttered, her voice faltering. I thought he. You thought? The man's voice cut through her words, his tone sharp and disapproving. You profiled him, Officer Michaels. You saw a black man in a nice car, and you assumed the worst. His gaze was unwavering as he turned to Jamal. I'm sorry, sir. This shouldn't have happened. Jamal stood silently, his chest tightening as he absorbed the exchange. He wasn't surprised by the officer's reaction, he had seen it too many times in his life. The systemic biases, the assumptions, the way people of color were often treated with suspicion, even when they had done nothing wrong. He wasn't shocked, but he was tired. Tired of fighting these small battles every day, tired of being judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. But now, this was his moment. It wasn't just about him. It was about something larger, about holding people accountable for their actions, about making sure that this didn't happen to someone else. And he wasn't going to let this moment slip away. The man in the suit turned to Officer Michaels, his voice now hard. You don't think, Officer Michaels. You verify. You don't make assumptions based on appearances, especially not when it comes to someone of his stature. He gestured to Jamal, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jamal felt the tension shift. For the first time since the stop began, he saw the officer's arrogance crack. Officer Michaels was visibly rattled, her posture shifting as she took in what was happening. It was clear she was realizing, perhaps for the first time, the consequences of her actions. She had made a mistake, and it was a big one. Jamal remained composed as the man in the suit spoke with authority. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, the quiet murmurs from the sidewalk, the sense of disbelief that had turned into something else, something more profound. Jamal had never been the kind of person to seek attention. But this moment, this confrontation, was bigger than him. It was about challenging the systemic issues that allowed people to be treated unfairly based on race, and it was about making sure the people responsible were held accountable. The man in the suit turned to Officer Michaels one final time. We'll be looking into this, he said, his tone cold. I suggest you think long and hard about how you treat people, officer. Especially people like Judge Hayes. Jamal felt the weight of the apology in the man's words, though it was far from enough. He had been wronged, yes. But this wasn't just about him. It was about sending a message that these kinds of mistakes couldn't go unchecked, that the system had to do better. I'll be filing a report, Jamal said, his voice steady but firm. And I want to make sure this isn't just swept under the rug. The man nodded, his expression grim. Of course, Judge Hayes. We'll make sure this is handled properly. Jamal turned to Officer Michaels, his gaze piercing as he spoke. You have a lot to learn, officer, he said quietly. This could have ended very differently for both of us. I hope you take that to heart. With that, Jamal walked back to his car, leaving the officer standing there, her world turned upside down by the realization that her assumptions had led her astray. As he slid into his vehicle and started the engine, Jamal glanced one last time at the officer. She was standing there, visibly shaken, her face red with embarrassment and regret. As the car pulled away, Jamal couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. He had used restraint, wisdom, and courage to navigate a situation that had the potential to escalate into something far worse. But he had also done something else, he had set an example. An example for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong, an example for anyone who had ever been mistreated, an example for those who were willing to stand up and speak out against injustice, no matter the consequences. The sun had set completely by now, and Jamal felt the weight of the evening lift from his shoulders as he drove into the quiet night. But as much as this moment had provided a small victory, he knew the battle was far from over. There were many more challenges ahead. But today, he had made a difference. And tomorrow, he would continue the fight. The ripple effect of justice. The days following the confrontation with Officer Michaels were a blur for Judge Jamal Hayes. His decision to remain composed, to act with restraint, and to confront the situation with dignity had earned him respect from some quarters, but it had also sparked debates that reverberated far beyond the quiet neighborhood where the incident had occurred. His phone rang incessantly, with calls from colleagues, journalists, and even strangers who had seen the news or heard about the encounter. Some praised his calm and patience, others, too, expressed their shock that such an incident had even happened in the first place. But for Jamal, it wasn't about the recognition or the headlines. The purpose behind his actions ran much deeper than the fleeting satisfaction of being validated by the public eye. It was about something far more profound, the real, tangible effects of systemic bias and how that bias could be challenged. He knew this was only one small chapter in a much larger narrative that was constantly unfolding, a narrative where the lines between justice and injustice, fairness and prejudice, were often blurred. His goal wasn't simply to react to the situation, but to change the conversation. The phone call with the man in the suit, the one who had arrived just in time to stop Officer Michaels from taking the situation further, had been brief, but it had been clear. The officer was going to face disciplinary action. Jamal had heard it all before. The promises, the reassurances, the talk about systemic change that rarely went anywhere. This time, however, something felt different. The man who had come to his defense wasn't just another face in a sea of bureaucratic indifference. He was the head of a department that Jamal had worked closely with for years. He knew this man understood the gravity of what had happened, not just on a personal level, but on a societal level. Jamal's thoughts drifted back to that moment, the exact moment when Officer Michaels had realized who he was, when the veil of suspicion had been lifted and her actions were exposed for what they were. He could still hear her stammering, the panic in her voice as the truth began to sink in. "I didn't know," she had said, but Jamal had heard it 1,000 times before. The excuses, the apologies that came too late. The systemic bias that allowed these incidents to happen over and over again. It was always the same, the presumption of guilt based on nothing more than the color of someone's skin. Yet, Jamal had chosen not to react in anger, even though every fiber of his being had wanted to. Instead, he had used the moment as an opportunity to teach, to remind those around him that true justice could never be served while people were allowed to make assumptions based on their own prejudices. He had decided that Officer Michaels' apology, while necessary, wasn't enough. What mattered more was ensuring that this type of behavior was addressed at a systemic level, that the kind of discrimination he had faced would not become another statistic in the ever-growing list of racially motivated incidents that went unnoticed and unchallenged. As Jamal sat in his office the following week, going through his usual caseload, his thoughts returned to the larger issue at hand. The encounter had been an eye-opener, a jarring reminder of the work that still needed to be done. But it had also made him more determined than ever to use his platform, his position, to make sure that this story didn't end with just one officer's apology. He knew that the seeds for change had been planted that night, but it was going to take much more than just a few kind words and promises of reform. The phone call he had made to his colleagues and contacts after the incident had been an important first step. He had reached out to the head of the police department, to fellow judges, and to activists who had long fought for racial justice. The outpouring of support had been overwhelming. What Jamal had not expected, however, were the stories that began to surface in the wake of his own. People from all over the country reached out to him, ordinary citizens, colleagues, even strangers, sharing their own experiences with racial profiling and discrimination. Some had been subjected to similar humiliations, others had witnessed firsthand the unfair treatment that marginalized communities faced on a daily basis. It became clear to Jamal that what had happened to him wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, entrenched system of bias and inequality that affected people of color in every aspect of their lives, from the police officers who patrolled their neighborhoods to the judges who made life-altering decisions in courtrooms. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk reading through an email from an activist group seeking his support for a new initiative aimed at addressing police profiling, Jamal felt a shift within himself. It was one thing to speak out against injustice, but it was another to actively fight for change. Jamal had always believed in the power of the law to right wrongs, but this situation had shown him that laws alone wouldn't be enough. They had to be supported by a commitment to real action, real accountability. Jamal spent the next several weeks meeting with local community leaders, police officers, and advocates. He began speaking openly about his experience, not to garner sympathy, but to inspire change. He talked about how racial profiling had affected his own life, not just as a judge, but as a man who had lived with the constant weight of being seen as other. He shared his vision for a future where people were judged by their character, not by the assumptions placed on them by the color of their skin. It was a message that resonated with many, and Jamal found himself at the center of a growing movement that sought to bring real reform to the criminal justice system. But as he pushed forward, Jamal knew that change would take time. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it certainly wouldn't happen through one encounter with an officer. The systemic problems that had led to that moment ran deep, woven into the very fabric of society. It was going to require more than just a few well-meaning conversations and a couple of disciplinary actions. It would take sustained effort, community organizing, policy changes, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the way race shaped people's experiences in this country. Jamal also spent a significant amount of time reflecting on Officer Michaels. He had told her that day that she had a lot to learn. But as he thought about it more, he realized that she wasn't the only one who needed to learn. There was still so much he needed to understand about the intricacies of racial inequality, about how deeply ingrained biases could shape even the most well-intentioned individuals. He thought about how the training within the police force, the courts, and even schools could be more focused on dismantling those biases, ensuring that people in positions of power were equipped not just to enforce the law, but to uphold the very ideals of fairness and justice. A few months later, Jamal found himself back in court, handling a new case. But this time, there was a sense of quiet satisfaction in his heart as he presided over the proceedings. He had taken the steps necessary to begin the process of real change, and he knew it would be a long road ahead. But as he looked around the courtroom, he realized that it was moments like this, moments when justice was served, when fairness prevailed, that kept him grounded. The phone call he had made that night to address the situation with Officer Michaels had been a catalyst. It had started a conversation that, while difficult, was necessary. And Jamal was determined to ensure that the conversation didn't stop there. He knew that change, while slow, was inevitable when enough people stood up and demanded it. As he sat back in his chair, reflecting on the journey ahead, Jamal understood something fundamental about the work he had chosen to dedicate his life to. True justice was not something that could be achieved in a courtroom alone. It had to be lived, experienced, and fought for every single day. And that was the work that he, and so many others, would continue to do. The legacy of justice. The months following the encounter with Officer Michaels were some of the most pivotal in Judge Jamal Hayes' life. The media attention had subsided, but the ripples of that moment were still felt. Jamal's decision to not only stand up for himself but also demand broader change had shifted something deep within him. He had always believed in justice, in the law, but now he understood more fully that true justice was not just about making rulings in the courtroom, it was about challenging systems, confronting biases, and ensuring that everyone, no matter their background or appearance, was treated fairly. While the immediate fallout from the incident with Officer Michaels had been resolved, Michaels faced disciplinary action, and the department promised reforms. Jamal knew that the road to lasting change would be long and arduous. The incident was a stark reminder of the work that still lay ahead in tackling racial profiling, systemic discrimination, and the entrenched biases that plagued many institutions. He had seen firsthand how deeply those biases ran, how assumptions could be made based on someone's appearance, and how easily a simple traffic stop could escalate into something much more dangerous when unchecked prejudices took hold. Determined to make a lasting difference, Jamal committed himself to the cause of reform. He used his influence as a judge to advocate for greater transparency and accountability within the justice system. He worked closely with organizations that sought to bring awareness to racial inequalities, speaking out at rallies, participating in panels, and meeting with lawmakers to push for policy changes. He understood that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was willing to be part of the movement that demanded it. One of the first steps Jamal took was helping to establish a new initiative within his local police department. The department, having seen the public outcry over the incident, had agreed to introduce new training programs focused on racial bias and community engagement. But Jamal knew that it wasn't enough to simply mandate training. He wanted to ensure that it was thorough, ongoing, and made a real difference in the way officers interacted with the community. He played an active role in shaping these programs, bringing in experts on racial justice and bias, as well as individuals who had experienced the harsh realities of profiling. Jamal also began advocating for body cameras for all officers, a measure he believed would increase accountability and reduce the potential for misuse of power. It wasn't a foolproof solution, but he knew it was an important step toward restoring trust between the police and the communities they served. And, perhaps most importantly, it allowed for transparency in situations where misconduct could easily be brushed under the rug. Despite his deep involvement in these reform efforts, Jamal knew that real change required more than just legislation and training programs. It needed a shift in culture, a culture that prioritized empathy, understanding, and respect for all individuals, regardless of their race or background. This, he believed, was where the real work lay. Jamal's public support for these reforms wasn't just rooted in a desire to see the system corrected for people like him. It was about ensuring that future generations would not have to face the same prejudices, the same assumptions, that had been so prevalent in his own life. He was determined that his children, and children like them, would grow up in a world where fairness wasn't something to be fought for, but something inherent in every interaction, every law, every policy. As part of his broader efforts to combat racial inequality, Jamal began mentoring young people in his community. He opened a mentorship program specifically designed for students of color, providing them with guidance, career advice, and support as they navigated an often hostile world. He wanted to show these young people that they, too, could be successful, that they too could rise above the challenges that life might throw their way. In his talks with the students, he shared his own story, of growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, of fighting to make his way through the legal system, and of ultimately becoming one of the most respected judges in the state. Through his mentorship, Jamal also worked to instill in them a sense of justice and the importance of standing up for what was right. He emphasized that the power to effect change didn't always come from the top down. Sometimes, it came from the courage of individuals who were willing to speak out, to act, and to challenge the status quo. He told them that while their journey might not be easy, it would be worth it, because the fight for justice was one that was bigger than any single person. As the years passed, Jamal's efforts slowly began to bear fruit. The reforms he had helped initiate within the police department became a model for other cities across the state. More and more departments adopted similar programs, incorporating racial bias training, community engagement efforts, and policies designed to hold officers accountable for their actions. Although the changes were small at first, they began to accumulate, creating a momentum that could no longer be ignored. Jamal's name became synonymous with justice not just because of his role as a judge, but because of the changes he fought for, changes that were finally beginning to take hold. His story was told in classrooms, in courtrooms, and in communities across the country, inspiring others to take a stand and demand a better future. His decision to not let Officer Michael's mistake be swept under the rug had sparked a movement that was growing stronger every day. But even with the progress, Jamal knew that there was still so much work to be done. For every policy change, for every success story, there were still countless others who were wrongfully profiled, unfairly judged, or denied opportunities because of their race. There were still systems in place that perpetuated inequality, and Jamal understood that it was up to people like him, people willing to confront the truth and take action, to continue the fight. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in his office reflecting on the changes he had been a part of, he received a letter from Officer Michaels. She had sent it to his chambers, a handwritten note of apology and reflection. In it, she expressed her regret for the incident and admitted that her actions had been motivated by bias. She acknowledged the deep harm caused by her assumptions, and shared how she had worked tirelessly to learn from that mistake. The letter wasn't just an apology, it was a testament to the growth and understanding that could come from even the most painful moments. It wasn't the closure Jamal had expected, but it was the kind of change that he believed could only come from honest self-reflection. Jamal read the letter with mixed emotions. He had forgiven Michaels long ago, but seeing her take responsibility for her actions, and acknowledging the broader issue of racial bias in policing, was a step toward the kind of world he had been working to create. It was proof that change was possible, even for those who had once held prejudices. As he placed the letter on his desk and gazed out the window, Jamal felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long, and it was far from over, but he knew that his legacy was being built on more than just the decisions he made in the courtroom. It was being built on the lives he had touched, the reforms he had helped implement, and the courage it took to stand up and speak out when it mattered most. The fight for justice would continue, but Jamal knew he had done his part. The world was slowly changing, one step at a time. And he would keep pushing forward, knowing that, no matter how hard the road ahead might be, the future was brighter because of the work that had already been done.